When Sarah Chen inherited a crumbling mountain cabin from her great-aunt in the Colorado Rockies, she never imagined that the mysterious wooden chest hidden beneath rotting floorboards contained Meriwether Lewis's personal journal with detailed treasure maps that would lead to the discovery of a lost cache from the Lewis and Clark expedition, transform her struggling family's future, and ultimately rewrite American exploration history while revealing secrets the Smithsonian had been searching for over 2 centuries. Before we dive into this incredible journey, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this story amazes you like it did me, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I have another mind-blowing discovery story that you absolutely won't want to miss. Sarah Chen stood on the wraparound porch of the most neglected cabin she'd ever seen, clutching a rusted key and a letter from a lawyer she'd never met. At 28, the struggling single mother had been working double shifts as a night shift nurse in Denver while raising her 7-year-old son Marcus alone, barely keeping their heads above water financially. The medical bills from Marcus's asthma treatments had drained their savings, and Sarah had been considering taking a 3rd job just to cover rent on their tiny apartment. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning that started like any other disaster. Sarah had woken up to discover their car wouldn't start. Marcus was wheezing again, and she'd received another past-due notice from the electric company. She'd been stirring instant coffee with a plastic spoon because they'd run out of clean silverware when the mailman knocked with a certified letter requiring her signature. Margaret Chen had been Sarah's great-aunt, her grandmother's sister, who had disappeared into the Colorado wilderness sometime in the 1960s and was rarely spoken about at family gatherings. Sarah had vague memories of whispered conversations about Aunt Maggie being eccentric, a recluse, who'd chosen mountains over people, solitude over society. The family had assumed she'd died years ago, but apparently Margaret had been very much alive until 3 months ago, living alone in a remote cabin 40 miles outside of Vail. According to the lawyer's letter, Margaret had left the cabin and its contents to Sarah, the only family member who had ever shown interest in history and exploration. Sarah remembered now, as a child, mentioning to her grandmother that she wanted to be an archaeologist when she grew up. Somehow that childhood dream had reached Margaret's ears across decades of family silence, influencing a decision that would change everything. The drive up the winding mountain road had taken 3 hours in Sarah's borrowed car, Marcus chattering excitedly in the back seat about living in the mountains like a pioneer. The higher they climbed, the more Sarah's heart sank. This wasn't the charming mountain retreat she'd foolishly allowed herself to imagine. The cabin sat at the end of a barely passable dirt road, surrounded by towering pines and accessed only by a wooden bridge that looked like it might collapse under the weight of a strong wind. The structure itself was a testament to decades of neglect. Built sometime in the early 1900s, the log cabin had weathered to a silver-grey color, with chunks of chinking missing between the logs. The metal roof showed patches of rust and several loose panels that clanged ominously in the mountain breeze. Windows were either cracked or boarded up with plywood, and the front steps sagged dangerously under their feet. Marcus pressed his face against the car window, his breath fogging the glass. "Mom, is this really ours? It looks like a haunted house from a movie." Sarah forced enthusiasm into her voice, while her practical mind calculated repair costs they couldn't afford. "It just needs some love, buddy. Think of it as a project, like building with your Legos, but bigger." The October air at 8,000 feet carried a bite that reminded Sarah winter was coming fast. Snow already dusted the highest peaks visible through the trees, and she realized with growing dread that the cabin probably wasn't winterized. If they were going to live here, they'd need heating, insulation and repairs that would cost thousands of dollars they didn't have. She'd driven up here with a desperate plan forming in her mind. The Denver apartment lease was up at the end of the month, and she couldn't afford the rent increase. Maybe, just maybe, they could make the cabin livable enough to get through winter. It would save money on rent, and Marcus's asthma might actually improve in the clean mountain air, away from city pollution. The nearest town was Pine Ridge, population 847, according to the welcome sign they'd passed, which boasted a general store, a diner, and a volunteer fire department. The key turned with surprising ease, and the heavy wooden door swung open with a prolonged creak that sent ravens scattering from nearby trees. The smell hit them immediately, a mixture of dust, old wood, and something else Sarah couldn't identify, something earthy and wild that seemed to carry the essence of decades spent in mountain solitude. Inside, her phone's flashlight revealed a space frozen in time. Margaret's belongings remained exactly as she'd left them, creating an archaeological layer of one woman's mountain existence. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace surrounded by hand-carved furniture that looked like it had been made by someone who understood both craftsmanship and necessity. Bookshelves lined every available wall, packed with volumes on geology, botany, history, and exploration. A kitchen table sat covered with maps, some modern topographical surveys, but others that looked genuinely antique, hand-drawn with faded ink and careful notations in what appeared to be multiple handwritings. Mason jars filled with collected stones, pressed flowers, and what looked like arrowheads covered every surface. Margaret had clearly been a collector, someone who found significance in the smallest discoveries. The single bedroom contained a simple bed covered with handmade quilts, a dresser carved from what looked like local pine, and more books stacked on every surface. But it was the loft, accessed by a steep wooden ladder, that made Sarah's heart race with possibility. The space under the eaves had been converted into a study, with a desk positioned perfectly to catch morning light through a small window facing east toward the Continental Divide. Marcus climbed the ladder with the fearless enthusiasm of childhood, his voice echoing down from above. "Mum, there's treasure maps up here. Real treasure maps with X marks and everything." Sarah's practical nurse training kicked in immediately. "Be careful up there, honey. Don't touch anything until I can check if it's safe." But as she climbed the ladder herself, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. The loft wasn't just a study, it was a shrine to exploration and discovery. The walls were covered with maps of Colorado, some dating back over a century, marked with notes and roots in Margaret's careful handwriting. A large corkboard displayed what appeared to be a timeline of Western exploration, complete with photographs, newspaper clippings, and hand-copied excerpts from historical documents. The desk held journals, dozens of them, filled with Margaret's observations about local geology, wildlife patterns, weather cycles, and something that made Sarah's breath catch: theories about historical expeditions that had passed through this exact area, references to the Lewis and Clark expedition, the Pike expedition, and various mountain men whose routes had crisscrossed these mountains in the early 1800s. One journal lay open, Margaret's final entries visible in shaking handwriting that told the story of a woman who knew her time was ending but had one last secret to share. "The cache remains hidden where I found it 40 years ago. The journal confirms what I always suspected about the northern route. Sarah will understand. She has the curiosity gene, the need to know what lies beyond the next ridge. The secret dies with me unless she looks deeper than surface rot." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the entry. Margaret had known she was dying, and had specifically chosen Sarah to inherit not just a cabin, but a mystery. The reference to looking deeper than surface rot seemed deliberately cryptic, as if Margaret was leaving clues for someone she trusted to solve a puzzle decades in the making. The practical part of Sarah's mind, the part that had kept her family afloat through years of struggle, whispered warnings about getting distracted by fantasies when they needed to focus on survival. They had maybe $3,000 left in savings, a son whose medical needs were constant, and winter approaching, in a cabin that needed extensive repairs just to be habitable. But the part of her that had once dreamed of archaeological discoveries, the part that had chosen nursing partly because it involved solving mysteries of human health, felt a familiar stirring. Margaret's final journal entries weren't the ramblings of an isolated woman. They were the careful documentation of someone who had spent decades researching, cross-referencing historical accounts with geographical evidence, building a case for something extraordinary. Marcus's voice brought her back to immediate concerns. "Mom, I'm getting cold. Can we make a fire?" The temperature was dropping as afternoon shadows lengthened, and she realized they'd need to decide quickly whether to drive back to Denver or figure out how to spend the night in the cabin. The fireplace looked functional, and Margaret had left a substantial pile of seasoned wood stacked beside it. The flue drew properly when Sarah tested it, and soon they had a crackling fire that transformed the cabin's atmosphere completely. The dancing flames revealed details she'd missed in the phone's harsh LED light. The furniture wasn't just functional, it was beautiful, crafted by someone who understood both form and necessity. As warmth filled the room, Sarah began to see the cabin through different eyes. The location was spectacular, perched on a natural shelf that offered views of 3 different mountain ranges. The construction was solid, built by someone who understood mountain weather and had planned for permanence. Most of the needed repairs were cosmetic, weatherproofing and updating rather than structural reconstruction. They ate dinner from cans warmed over the fire, Marcus treating the whole experience as the greatest adventure of his young life. "It's like camping, but inside. Can we live here, Mom? Really live here?" His enthusiasm was infectious, and Sarah found herself calculating possibilities instead of problems. The nearest school was in Pine Ridge, a 20-minute drive down the mountain. Her nursing license was valid in Colorado, and mountain communities always needed medical professionals. The cost of living would be dramatically lower than Denver, and Marcus's asthma had already improved in the clean air. Maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. That night, as Marcus slept peacefully in the loft, wrapped in Margaret's handmade quilts, Sarah sat by the dying fire reading her great-aunt's journals by lamplight. The entries painted a picture of a woman who had chosen isolation, not from misanthropy, but from passion. Margaret had been a self-taught historian and amateur archaeologist who had spent 40 years documenting every historical reference to their specific valley. The journals revealed that multiple expeditions had passed through this area in the early 1800s, drawn by a natural pass that offered relatively easy passage through the continental divide. Margaret had traced references in various historical documents, cross-referenced them with geological surveys, and built a compelling case that several important caches had been buried in the area by expeditions that had run into trouble. But it was the final journal, the one Sarah had found open on the desk, that contained the most intriguing references. Margaret wrote about a discovery she'd made in 1983, something she'd kept secret for 40 years, waiting for the right person to entrust with the knowledge. "The Lewis cache is real," Margaret had written in careful script. "The journal proves. They took the northern route in 1806, not the southern route historians have always assumed. The flooding that year forced them higher into the mountains, and they cached supplies here that were never recovered. I found the hiding place by accident, but I was too old to do anything with the discovery. It needs someone young, someone with the strength to bring the truth to light." Sarah closed the journal and stared into the glowing coals. Was this real, or the fantasy of a woman who'd spent too many years alone with her obsessions? Historical caches were discovered occasionally, but something from the Lewis and Clark expedition would be beyond significant. It would be one of the most important archaeological discoveries in American history. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and reminding her of more immediate concerns. Tomorrow, she'd need to decide whether to return to Denver and their impossible rent situation, or commit to making the cabin livable before winter set in. The choice felt bigger than just housing. It felt like choosing between the life she'd known and the life she'd once dreamed of living. As she banked the fire for the night, Sarah caught herself looking at the floorboards with new eyes. Margaret's cryptic reference to looking deeper than surface rot suddenly seemed less metaphorical. If there really was something hidden in the cabin, something Margaret had waited 40 years to share, where would a careful researcher hide the most important discovery of her lifetime? The old floorboards creaked under her feet as she moved around the room, and she found herself testing each step, listening for hollow sounds, feeling for loose boards. The practical nurse in her recognized the signs of water damage in several areas, places where the wood had softened and would need replacement before winter. But Margaret's words echoed in her mind as she climbed to the loft where Marcus slept peacefully. Look deeper than surface rot. What if the damage she was seeing wasn't just neglect? What if some of it was deliberate, strategic, designed to hide something that had been waiting decades for the right person to discover it? Sarah settled onto the narrow bed beside her son, listening to his steady breathing and the wind in the pines outside. Tomorrow would bring decisions that would shape their future. But tonight, in a cabin filled with decades of one woman's passionate research, surrounded by maps and journals and the promise of secrets waiting to be uncovered, Sarah Chen allowed herself to dream of possibilities that extended far beyond mere survival. The mountains held their secrets close, but Margaret had spent a lifetime learning to listen to what they whispered. And now, in a twist of fate that felt like destiny, those secrets were Sarah's inheritance, along with the cabin, the solitude, and the choice between the safe path and the extraordinary one. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only exists at high altitude, sunlight streaming through the cabin's cracked windows and painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Sarah woke to the sound of Marcus coughing, a wet, rattling sound that immediately sent her into full medical alert mode. She'd forgotten to bring his nebulizer up the mountain, and the dry air combined with dust from the old cabin was triggering his asthma. Within minutes, she had him sitting up, using the breathing techniques they'd practiced countless times, while her mind raced through their options. The nearest pharmacy was in Pine Ridge, 20 minutes down a winding mountain road that she wasn't sure her borrowed car could handle in an emergency. This was exactly the kind of situation that made single motherhood feel like walking a tightrope. Without a net. "I'm okay, Mom," Marcus wheezed between controlled breaths, but Sarah could see the slight blue tinge around his lips that meant his oxygen saturation was dropping. She'd seen this progression too many times in the pediatric ward. They needed to get back to Denver, back to his regular pulmonologist, back to the safety net of urban medical care. The romantic notion of mountain living crashed against the harsh reality of being 40 miles from the nearest hospital with a chronically ill child. Sarah began gathering their few belongings with the efficiency of someone accustomed to emergency departures, her heart heavy with disappointment, but her priorities crystal clear. As she loaded their overnight bags into the car, Sarah took one last look around the cabin that had briefly represented possibility. Margaret's journals still lay scattered across the desk, maps still covered the walls, and somewhere beneath the rotting floorboards allegedly lay secrets that could change history. But history wouldn't help Marcus breathe, and adventure stories wouldn't pay for his medications. The drive down the mountain felt like descent from a dream, back into the unforgiving reality of their actual life. Marcus slept fitfully in the back seat, his breathing gradually improving as they lost altitude, while Sarah's mind catalogued the impossibilities that made mountain living a fantasy she couldn't afford. The cabin needed a minimum of $15,000 in repairs before winter, money they absolutely didn't have. The heating system was a wood stove that would require constant attention, impossible to maintain while working 12-hour nursing shifts. The access road would be impassable during heavy snow, trapping them for days or weeks at a time. And, most critically, they'd be too far from medical facilities if Marcus had a serious asthma attack. Back in Denver, their cramped apartment felt like a cage after the expansive mountain views, but it also felt safe in ways Sarah hadn't fully appreciated. The nebulizer was in the bedroom closet, Marcus's inhaler in the kitchen drawer, the children's hospital 20 minutes away on city streets that were plowed within hours of any snowfall. She spent the afternoon on the phone with landlords, discovering that affordable apartments had become even scarcer in the 3 days they'd been gone. The rental market in Denver had tightened like a noose, with studios now renting for what 2-bedroom apartments had cost just 2 years earlier. Every conversation ended the same way, with her explaining that yes, she was a registered nurse, with steady employment. But no, she couldn't provide first month's rent, last month's rent, and security deposit totaling nearly $4,000. That evening, as she helped Marcus with his homework at their kitchen table, Sarah found herself staring at the pile of bills that had accumulated during their brief mountain adventure, the electric company's final notice, a collections letter from Marcus's last emergency room visit, a credit card statement showing a balance that made her stomach clench with anxiety. The numbers were unforgiving in their mathematical certainty. Her nursing salary, even with overtime shifts, barely covered their basic expenses. Marcus's medical costs, even with insurance, created a constant drain that prevented any accumulation of savings. They were living month to month, crisis to crisis, with no buffer for emergencies or opportunities. At 2 a.m., unable to sleep, Sarah found herself Googling property management companies in Pine Ridge, researching remote work opportunities for nurses, investigating homeschooling requirements for Colorado. Part of her recognized this as fantasy, the same magical thinking that led people to buy lottery tickets and believe in get-rich-quick schemes. But another part, the part that had once dreamed of archaeological discoveries and historical mysteries, whispered that Margaret hadn't chosen her randomly. The inheritance wasn't just a cabin. It was an invitation to a different kind of life, one where financial survival wasn't the only consideration. The next day brought a phone call that crystallized their impossible situation. The apartment complex was implementing a 30% rent increase effective immediately, bringing their monthly housing cost to $1,800 for a space barely large enough for 2 people. Sarah did the math 3 times, hoping for a different result, but the conclusion remained unchanged. They couldn't afford to stay, and they couldn't afford to leave. Marcus noticed her distress during dinner, his 7-year-old intuition picking up on tension she tried to hide. "Are we going to be homeless, Mom?" he asked with the matter-of-fact curiosity of childhood, unaware that his question hit like a physical blow. "We're going to figure something out," Sarah replied automatically, the same response she'd been giving herself for weeks. But the options were narrowing to a point that felt like a funnel, with only one opening wide enough to pass through. That night, she spread Margaret's journals across their kitchen table, reading by the light of a lamp that flickered intermittently. Because she'd been postponing the electric bill, the entries painted a picture of a woman who had chosen uncertainty over security, adventure over comfort, purpose over profit. Arrived at the cabin today, Margaret had written in 1964, bought it for $800 from a family who thought I was insane to want to live so far from civilization. They have no idea what treasures hide in these mountains, what stories are written in stone and stream. Entry after entry documented Margaret's transformation from city dweller to mountain researcher, chronicling her discoveries about local geology, her theories about historical expeditions, her growing conviction that the valley held secrets worth dedicating a lifetime to uncovering. "The real treasure isn't gold or silver," she'd written years later. "It's knowledge, understanding, the satisfaction of solving puzzles that have waited centuries for the right person to ask the right questions." Sarah closed the journal and looked around their apartment, seeing it with fresh eyes. The cramped space, the thin walls through which they could hear every argument from their neighbors, the windows that faced another building just 15 feet away. This wasn't living, it was surviving, and there was a difference. The phone rang, startling her from her contemplation. The caller ID showed Pine Ridge General Store, a number she didn't recognize. "Is this Sarah Chen?" The voice was elderly, female, with the careful diction of someone choosing words deliberately. "Yes, this is Sarah. This is Eleanor Whitfield. I own the general store in Pine Ridge. I was friends with your great-aunt Margaret. I heard you inherited her place." Sarah felt a flutter of surprise and something else, a sense of connection to Margaret's world that she hadn't expected. "Yes, I did. I'm sorry for your loss. Margaret seems to have been a remarkable woman." She was indeed. "Listen, dear, I'm calling because Margaret asked me to watch for you. She said if her great-niece ever showed up, I should tell you something important." The flutter became a racing heartbeat. "What did she want you to tell me?" "That the cabin holds more than just shelter. She said you'd understand what that means when you were ready. She also said to tell you that Pine Ridge takes care of its own, and we need a nurse badly enough to make it worth your while." Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. "I'm not sure I understand. Dr. Patterson, our only physician, is 78 and wants to retire. The county health department has been trying to recruit medical staff for 2 years. There's a sign-on bonus, housing assistance, and a guaranteed position for any qualified nurse willing to relocate to our area." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Eleanor painting a picture of a community that valued essential services above profit margins, where a nurse's salary would go 3 times as far as it did in Denver, where neighbors still looked out for each other, and 7-year-old boys could explore mountains instead of being confined to concrete playgrounds. After hanging up, Sarah sat in their flickering lamplight and felt the universe shifting around. Margaret's inheritance wasn't just a cabin, it was a doorway to possibilities she'd convinced herself were impossible. The next morning, she called in sick to the hospital and spent the day researching Pine Ridge's medical facilities, the county health department's incentive programs, and Colorado's homeschooling regulations. Every search result pointed toward the same conclusion. What seemed impossible in Denver became achievable in a mountain community that desperately needed her skills. Marcus found her surrounded by printouts and laptop screens when he came home from school. "Are we moving to the mountain house, Mom?" Sarah looked at her son, seeing excitement instead of anxiety in his expression, hope instead of fear. "Would you like that?" "Yes. I could explore like a real adventurer, and maybe we could find treasure like Great-Aunt Margaret wrote about in her journals." That evening, Sarah made a list of everything that would need to happen to make the move possible. Repairs to make, the cabin habitable, arrangements for Marcus's education, transfer of her nursing license, logistics of living 40 miles from the nearest grocery store. Each item seemed manageable individually, but collectively they represented a complete reconstruction of their lives. But as she worked through the details, Sarah realized that every obstacle had a solution if she was willing to embrace uncertainty. Instead of clinging to the familiar, the Pine Ridge position offered enough signing bonus to cover immediate repairs. Marcus's asthma had already improved during their brief mountain stay. Eleanor had mentioned other families with children who formed a tight-knit homeschooling community. At midnight, sitting at their kitchen table with Marcus asleep in the next room, Sarah made the decision that would change everything. She opened her laptop and began typing an email to the Pine Ridge County Health Department, accepting a position she hadn't yet been offered, committing to a future that existed only in possibility. The response came within hours. Dr. Patterson himself called, his voice warm with relief and welcome. "Miss Chen, we've been praying for someone like you. When can you start?" 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself once again standing on the cabin's sagging porch, but this time with a U-Haul truck full of their belongings, a signing bonus check in her pocket, and a 7-year-old boy who hadn't stopped smiling since they'd left Denver. The mountains looked different now, less intimidating and more welcoming, as if they recognized her commitment to staying. Eleanor had been true to her. Word about Pine Ridge taking care of its own. Half the town had volunteered to help with cabin repairs, bringing tools and expertise and casseroles that filled Margaret's ancient refrigerator. By the end of the first week, the cabin had a functioning heating system, weatherproofed windows, and enough insulation to survive a Colorado winter. Sarah's nursing position began with a caseload that included everything from prenatal care to geriatric medicine, challenging her skills in ways that big city nursing never had. Marcus thrived, in ways that surprised even Sarah's optimistic projections. His asthma attacks became rare, then non-existent in the clean mountain air. Eleanor's granddaughter became his best friend and study partner in their informal homeschool group. He developed a confident outdoors competence that would have been impossible in their Denver apartment, but it was the evenings that held the most promise. After Marcus was asleep and her nursing duties were complete, Sarah found herself drawn to Margaret's journals with the intensity of someone finally pursuing a calling rather than just earning a living. The entries became more fascinating as she understood the geographical references, could walk the same trails Margaret had explored, could see the same rock formations and water patterns that had inspired 40 years of dedicated research. And slowly, reading by lamplight in a cabin that had become home rather than just shelter, Sarah began to understand that Margaret's greatest discovery was still waiting to be revealed. 3 months into their new mountain life, Sarah had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable for the first time in years. Her nursing rounds took her throughout the Pine Ridge Valley, from the Henderson's ranch, where she monitored old Pete's diabetes, to the Morrison family's homestead, where she provided prenatal care for their 3rd child. The work was varied and challenging in ways that city nursing had never been, requiring her to be part medical professional, part counselor, and part detective, as she pieced together health patterns in a community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Marcus had adapted to mountain life with the resilience that seemed hardwired into childhood. His homeschool group met 3 days a week in Eleanor's back room at the general store, where 5 children ranging from 6 to 12 learned together under the guidance of retired teacher Mrs. Caldwell. The other days, he explored the endless trails around their cabin with a confidence that both thrilled and terrified Sarah, always returning with pockets full of interesting rocks, pressed flowers, and stories of wildlife encounters. The cabin itself had transformed from Margaret's hermitage into a functioning family home. The volunteer repair crew had accomplished miracles with limited resources, installing a modern wood-burning stove that heated the entire structure efficiently, upgrading the kitchen with propane appliances that didn't require connection to distant power grids, and creating a workshop space in the attached shed where Sarah had begun learning basic carpentry skills by necessity. But it was the financial transformation that felt most miraculous. For the first time since Marcus's birth, Sarah's income exceeded their expenses by a comfortable margin. The county health department's compensation package included housing allowances, medical coverage, and educational stipends that made their monthly budget feel spacious rather than suffocating. She'd even managed to establish a small emergency fund, something that had seemed impossible during their Denver years. Yet despite the apparent success of their mountain relocation, Sarah found herself increasingly drawn to Margaret's unsolved mystery. The journals had become her evening entertainment, more compelling than any television program or novel. Each entry revealed new layers of Margaret's research methodology, her growing conviction that the valley held archaeological treasures, and her frustration with academic institutions that dismissed her theories as the fantasies of an isolated amateur. The deeper Sarah read, the more convinced she became that Margaret's research was methodical, thorough, and potentially groundbreaking. Her great-aunt had spent decades cross-referencing historical documents, geological surveys, tribal oral histories, and early expedition journals to build a case that several major explorations had passed through their specific valley during the early 1800s. Margaret's theory centered on a natural disaster that had occurred in the spring of 1806. A massive flooding event caused by an ice dam failure that had forced the Lewis and Clark expedition to deviate from their planned return route. Instead of following the established southern passages through the Rockies, they had been driven north into higher elevations, following natural corridors that led directly through what was now the Pine Ridge Valley. The evidence Margaret had compiled was circumstantial but compelling. William Clark's journal contained references to a northern passage of great beauty but considerable challenge during the return journey. Meriwether Lewis had written about caching supplies at the confluence of three streams beneath the Granite Guardians, when weather and terrain forced extended delays. Most intriguingly, Sacagawea's translator had recorded tribal stories about white men who buried metal containers near the sacred springs during the year of the Great Flooding. Sarah had initially approached Margaret's research with professional skepticism, her nursing training having taught her to distinguish between evidence and wishful thinking. But as she cross-referenced Margaret's sources using modern internet resources unavailable in previous decades, she discovered that her great-aunt's theories aligned remarkably well with recent archaeological discoveries and revised historical scholarship. The Granite Guardians reference particularly intrigued her. From the cabin's front porch, she could see a distinctive rock formation about 2 miles up the valley, twin granite spires that rose like sentinels above the tree line. Local maps identified the area as Guardian Pass, and Margaret's journals contained dozens of entries documenting her explorations of the surrounding terrain. The confluence is clearly visible from the Guardians, Margaret had written in 1987. 3 streams converge exactly where Lewis described, creating the natural campsite any experienced expedition leader would choose. The elevation provides defensive positioning, while the water source ensures adequate supply. If they cached anything in this valley, it would be there. Sarah had hiked to Guardian Pass twice, ostensibly for exercise but actually to evaluate Margaret's geographical analysis. The site was exactly as described, a natural camping area protected by rock formations, with 3 streams converging to create a reliable water source and sightlines that would allow sentries to monitor approaches from multiple directions. It was precisely the kind of location that experienced wilderness travelers would choose for extended stays. But it was Margaret's final journal entries that transformed casual interest into consuming obsession. Written during the last months of her life, these pages contained references to discoveries that went far beyond theoretical research. Found it today, Margaret had written in handwriting that shook with either excitement or illness. 43 years of searching, and it was exactly where the clues said it would be. The metal container, the leather wrapping, the journal itself, everything Lewis described, preserved by altitude and aridity. But I'm too weak to bring it down alone, too old to do justice to the discovery. The entry was dated just 6 weeks before Margaret's death, suggesting she had made an actual find rather than continuing to theorize about possibilities. Subsequent entries described her internal struggle over what to do with the discovery, her concerns about authentication processes, and her growing conviction that the find needed someone younger and stronger to handle the physical and logistical challenges of proper archaeological documentation. The journal confirms everything she had written in trembling script. Lewis took the northern route because of flooding. They cached supplies at 3 different elevations, the highest being at Guardian Pass. The leather portfolio contains maps showing gold deposits they discovered but couldn't extract. More importantly, it contains Sacagawea's own account of the journey, written phonetically in her own hand with Lewis's help. This isn't just treasure, it's missing history. Sarah had read this entry dozens of times, each reading intensifying. Her conviction that Margaret wasn't fantasizing but reporting actual discoveries. The references to specific details, the careful documentation of locations, the awareness of historical significance all pointed toward genuine archaeological findings rather than wishful thinking. The practical challenges were daunting. Guardian Pass was accessible only by a steep hiking trail that climbed 2,000 feet in elevation over 4 miles of rough terrain. Weather windows for safe access were limited, particularly as winter approached and snow began accumulating at higher elevations. Sarah's nursing responsibilities made extended exploration impossible, and taking Marcus on such expeditions would be both dangerous and irresponsible. But the potential rewards were extraordinary. If Margaret's discoveries were authentic, they represented one of the most significant archaeological finds in American history. Lewis and Clark artifacts were preserved in museums across the country, but an intact cache from their expedition, particularly one containing previously unknown documents, would be priceless, both scientifically and monetarily. The financial implications alone were staggering. Authenticated Lewis and Clark materials sold at auction for hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions, depending on historical significance. A previously unknown journal by Meriwether Lewis would be worth more than Sarah could earn in several lifetimes of nursing. More importantly, such discoveries typically came with research grants, academic positions, and opportunities that could secure Marcus's educational future while allowing Sarah to pursue historical work that felt more like calling than career. Yet, she found herself paralyzed by uncertainty about next steps. Margaret's journals provided geographical clues, but no specific directions to the cache location. The references to metal containers and leather portfolios were tantalizing but vague. Most critically, Sarah had no way to authenticate anything. She might find or navigate the complex legal and academic processes required for legitimate archaeological discoveries. Her evening routine had evolved into a ritual of obsessive research. After Marcus was asleep, she would spread topographical maps across Margaret's old desk, comparing historical references with modern geographical data, trying to decode clues that had consumed her great-aunt's final decades. The work was fascinating, but frustrating, like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. Eleanor noticed her preoccupation during a routine grocery run in early December. "You've got that same look Margaret used to get," the elderly storekeeper observed while ringing up Sarah's purchases, "all consumed by something you can't quite reach." Sarah hesitated, then decided that Margaret's friend might understand her dilemma better than anyone else. "Did she ever tell you about her research? About what she thought was hidden up at Guardian Pass?" Eleanor's weathered hands paused over the cash register keys. "Child, Margaret talked about nothing else for the last 20 years. Most folks thought she was getting eccentric in her old age, spending all that time alone with her books and maps, but I knew her well enough to recognize the difference between fantasy and conviction. Do you think she actually found something? I think Margaret Chen was the most methodical person I ever met. She wouldn't claim discovery unless she was absolutely certain. Eleanor leaned across the counter, lowering her voice, even though they were alone in the store. Week before she died, she came in here asking about hiring pack horses and professional guides. Said she'd found something that needed proper recovery, but was too weak to handle it herself. Asked me to keep an eye out for someone with the right combination of physical capability and trustworthiness. The implication hung in the air between them. Sarah felt her heart racing with the same mixture of excitement and terror that had accompanied every major decision in her life. She left me some things, Eleanor continued, reaching under the counter, said to give them to you when you were ready to understand what she'd been trying to accomplish. The elderly woman produced a small wooden box, worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were items that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. A small metal disc, green with age, but clearly stamped with official markings. A piece of leather that felt ancient, but remained supple. And most intriguingly, a piece of paper covered with symbols that looked like a code or cipher. She said these came from the site, Eleanor whispered. Proof that what she found was real. Sarah lifted the metal disc with trembling fingers, recognizing immediately that it wasn't some random artifact. The markings were clearly military in nature, with dates and initials that corresponded exactly to the Lewis and Clark expedition timeline. The leather fragment showed tool marks consistent with early 19th century craftsmanship, and the coded paper resembled cryptographic systems known to have been used by the expedition for sensitive communications. Why didn't she report this to authorities? To museums or universities? Eleanor's laugh carried decades of mountain wisdom. Honey, Margaret tried that route for years, sent letters to the Smithsonian, contacted archaeology departments, reached out to Lewis and Clark scholars across the country. You know what they told her? That amateur treasure hunters were always claiming impossible discoveries, that legitimate finds came through established academic channels, that a self-taught researcher living alone in the mountains couldn't possibly have uncovered something that eluded professional archaeologists. The dismissal was both infuriating and entirely predictable. Sarah had encountered similar attitudes. In medical settings, where advanced degrees and institutional affiliations often mattered more than actual competence or discovery, Margaret had been marginalized not for lack of evidence, but for lack of credentials, so she decided to wait for someone who could do justice to the discovery, Sarah concluded. Someone with the right skills, the right motivation, and the right circumstances to pursue authentication properly. Eleanor's knowing look suggested she understood exactly why Margaret had chosen Sarah as her heir. That night, Sarah sat in the cabin's main room with Margaret's artifacts spread before her, feeling the weight of inherited responsibility. The metal disc, leather fragment, and coded paper represented more than just historical curiosities. They were keys to unlocking mysteries that had waited 2 centuries for revelation. Marcus noticed her preoccupation during their bedtime routine. Mom, you look like you did when you were trying to figure out how to pay for my medicine. Is something wrong? His innocent question crystallized her internal conflict. She had achieved financial stability, geographical satisfaction, and professional fulfillment beyond anything she'd imagined possible just months earlier. Their life was good, secure, and sustainable. Why risk disrupting that success by chasing archaeological fantasies that might prove to be elaborate delusions? But as she tucked Marcus into bed and listened to his easy breathing in the clean mountain air, Sarah realized that The question wasn't whether Margaret's discoveries were real. The question was whether she had the courage to find out, and if they were real, whether she had the strength to do justice to secrets that had waited 2 centuries for someone brave enough to reveal them. The winter snow was already accumulating at Guardian Pass, making exploration impossible until spring. But spring would come, and with it, decisions that could transform their stable mountain life into something far more uncertain, but potentially extraordinary. Margaret's journal lay open beside the artifacts, her final entry visible in the lamplight. The greatest treasures are always hidden in the most challenging places, waiting for someone willing to risk everything to claim them. Winter descended on Pine Ridge with the relentless determination that only mountain weather could muster, transforming Sarah's world into a crystalline prison that made any thoughts of exploration impossible. By January, snow had accumulated to depths that buried fence posts and transformed familiar landmarks into anonymous white mounds. The road to Guardian Pass became completely impassable, blocked by drifts that wouldn't clear until late April. At the earliest, the enforced waiting period felt like torture to Sarah, whose excitement about Margaret's discoveries had grown into a consuming obsession that invaded her thoughts during patient visits and kept her awake long after Marcus had fallen asleep. She found herself sketching maps during quiet moments at the clinic, calculating hiking distances and elevation gains, researching archaeological recovery techniques that she might need when spring finally arrived. Dr. Patterson noticed her distraction during a particularly busy week in February, when a stomach flu outbreak had overwhelmed their small medical facility. "Sarah, you're doing excellent work, but you seem like your mind is somewhere else entirely. Everything all right at home?" She deflected his concern with reassurances about adjustment stress and winter cabin fever, but the truth was more complicated. The artifacts Eleanor had given her sat in a locked box in Margaret's old desk, tangible proof that her great-aunt's decades of research had led to actual discoveries rather than theoretical speculation. The metal disc bore markings that perfectly matched expedition records she'd found in online archives. The leather fragment showed aging patterns consistent with early 19th century materials. Most compelling, the coded paper contained symbols that appeared in authenticated Lewis and Clark documents held by the Missouri Historical Society. Sarah had spent countless hours researching authentication processes for historical artifacts, learning about spectroscopic analysis, carbon dating procedures, and provenance documentation requirements. The legitimate path to proving Margaret's discoveries would require cooperation from established archaeological institutions, extensive laboratory testing, and legal documentation that could take years to complete. But she had also discovered a darker reality about artifact authentication. Legitimate finds required clear ownership documentation, detailed recovery records, and often involved lengthy legal battles over possession rights. Items discovered on private land belonged to the property owner, but anything of national historical significance could trigger federal intervention and eminent domain proceedings. The government had broad powers to claim artifacts deemed crucial to American heritage, often providing minimal compensation to discoverers. The financial calculations were both thrilling and terrifying. Authenticated Lewis and Clark materials commanded astronomical prices at auction, but only if clear legal title could be established. A disputed discovery could spend decades in legal limbo, while lawyers consumed any potential profits in fees and court costs. Margaret had been wise to keep her findings secret until she could transfer them to someone with the resources and determination to navigate the complex authentication process properly. Marcus had adapted to winter mountain life with typical childhood resilience, but even he noticed his mother's increasing preoccupation with historical research. Their evening routine now included him helping organize Margaret's journals by date, while Sarah cross-referenced geographical descriptions with modern topographical maps. He'd begun treating the mystery like an adventure game, creating elaborate theories about treasure locations and expedition routes that sometimes contained insights Sarah hadn't considered. "Mom, if the explorers were running from floods, they probably went to the highest safe place they could find, right?" he observed one evening while studying Margaret's hand-drawn maps. "And if they buried stuff, it would be somewhere they could remember how to find again, like near those big rocks that look like faces." His 7-year-old logic was surprisingly sophisticated, reflecting the same methodical thinking that had driven Margaret's research for decades. The big rocks that looked like faces were a distinctive formation, about halfway up the Guardian Pass Trail, prominently featured in several of Margaret's geological surveys, and mentioned in her journals as a likely landmark for any expedition traveling through the area. Eleanor stopped by the cabin regularly during the worst winter weeks, officially checking on their well-being, but actually providing companionship that Sarah desperately needed. The elderly storekeeper had become a repository of Margaret's secrets, and their conversations gradually revealed the full scope of her great-aunt's archaeological theories. Margaret wasn't just looking for Lewis and Clark artifacts. Eleanor explained during one particularly stormy evening when she'd stayed for dinner rather than risk driving home in blizzard conditions. She believed this whole valley was a major thoroughfare for early expeditions, a natural corridor that multiple groups used over several decades. The implications were staggering. Instead of a single cache from one expedition, Margaret might have discovered evidence of multiple historical groups who had used the valley as a safe passage through the mountains. Spanish conquistadors, French fur traders, American military expeditions, and civilian exploration parties could all have left traces of their presence over nearly 3 centuries of travel through the region. She found references to at least 4 different groups who mentioned landmarks that match this valley, Eleanor continued, warming her hands around a mug of coffee while snow hammered against the cabin windows. The Lewis and Clark cache was just the most recent and best documented. There might be Spanish silver from the 1600s, French trade goods from the 1700s, all sorts of historical treasures scattered throughout these mountains. Sarah felt simultaneously exhilarated and overwhelmed by the possibilities. A single, authenticated Lewis and Clark artifact could secure Marcus's college education and her own financial future. Multiple discoveries from different historical periods could represent generational wealth and establish the Pine Ridge Valley as one of the most significant archaeological sites in North America. But the responsibilities were equally daunting. Proper archaeological documentation required extensive expertise, sophisticated equipment, and careful coordination with academic institutions. A single mistake in recovery or documentation could destroy the scientific value of discoveries that had survived centuries of mountain weather. Sarah's nursing background provided some relevant skills in careful observation and precise documentation, but archaeology demanded specialized knowledge she didn't possess. The winter isolation also provided time for deeper research into the legal complexities surrounding archaeological discoveries. Sarah discovered that Colorado had specific statutes governing artifact recovery on private land, but federal laws could supersede state regulations for finds deemed nationally significant. The Archaeological Resources Protection Act gave government agencies broad authority to investigate and potentially seize important discoveries, regardless of where they were found or who owned the land. More troubling were the criminal penalties for improper handling of archaeological materials. Well-intentioned amateur discoverers had faced federal prosecution for failing to follow proper reporting procedures or for inadvertently damaging artifacts during recovery. The law made no distinction between treasure hunters seeking personal profit and legitimate researchers pursuing historical knowledge. Yet Sarah also found examples of amateur discoveries that had been properly authenticated and had brought both recognition and financial rewards to their discoverers. The key seemed to be establishing relationships with legitimate archaeological institutions before making recovery attempts, ensuring that proper expertise was available throughout the process. Dr. Rachel Morrison at the Colorado State University Archaeology Department had become Sarah's primary email correspondent during the long winter months. Initially skeptical of another amateur treasure hunter claiming major discoveries, Dr. Morrison had gradually warmed to Sarah's methodical approach to research and her obvious respect for proper archaeological procedures. "Your great-aunt's research methodology is actually quite sophisticated," Dr. Morrison had written in response to Sarah's detailed summary of Margaret's journals. She clearly understood the importance of cross-referencing multiple historical sources and correlating written accounts with geographical evidence. "While I can't commit university resources based on unverified claims, I would be very interested in examining any physical evidence she may have recovered." The response was encouraging but cautious, exactly what Sarah had expected from a professional archaeologist approached by an unknown amateur. Building credibility would require patience, careful documentation, and probably some preliminary discoveries that could be easily authenticated without major institutional involvement. March brought the first hints of spring, with afternoon temperatures climbing above freezing and snow beginning to consolidate into the hardpack that would eventually reveal hiking trails. Sarah found herself obsessively checking weather forecasts and trail condition reports, calculating when Guardian Pass might become accessible for the first serious exploration attempt. Marcus had grown tired of winter confinement and was equally eager for spring adventures, though his motivations were more about general outdoor exploration than specific treasure hunting. His asthma had completely disappeared during their months at altitude, and he developed the kind of physical confidence that came from daily outdoor activity in challenging terrain. "When can we go look for the treasure, Mom?" became his standard question whenever trail conditions were discussed. Sarah had tried to manage his expectations by explaining the difference between treasure hunting and archaeological research, but to a 7-year-old, the distinction seemed academic. "We're not looking for treasure, honey. We're trying to understand what Great-Aunt Margaret discovered and whether it's historically important enough to share with museums and universities. But if it's Lewis and Clark stuff, it's still treasure, right? Just treasure that belongs in a museum instead of in our house." His logic was both accurate and problematic. Sarah had been trying to convince herself that her motivations were purely scientific, driven by respect for Margaret's research and desire to preserve important historical knowledge. But the truth was more complicated, involving financial calculations that she couldn't entirely ignore. The Pine Ridge nursing position provided comfortable living but modest savings potential. Marcus would need college funding in 11 years, and Sarah's retirement planning remained precarious despite their improved circumstances. A significant archaeological discovery could solve those long-term financial concerns while also contributing to historical knowledge. Yet she was increasingly aware that treasure hunting and archaeological research required different approaches, different skills, and different relationships with legal and academic authorities. The distinction wasn't just philosophical. It could determine whether any discoveries resulted in recognition and legitimate rewards or prosecution and asset forfeiture. Dr. Patterson announced his retirement plans in early April, effective at the end of summer, which would make Sarah the primary medical provider for the entire Pine Ridge Valley. The responsibility was both flattering and intimidating, requiring expanded skills and probably additional training to handle the full range of medical situations that arose in remote mountain communities. The timing also created pressure regarding Margaret's archaeological mystery. If Sarah was going to pursue her great-aunt's discoveries seriously, it would need to happen during the brief window between spring trail access and her expanded medical responsibilities. Once she became the valley's only healthcare provider, extended exploration trips would become impossible. Eleanor sensed her growing urgency and offered practical assistance that Sarah hadn't expected. "I've been thinking about Margaret's situation," she said during one of their regular conversations. "She was too old to handle the physical demands of proper recovery, but you're too inexperienced to handle the technical requirements. What if we combined resources?" The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. Eleanor had maintained relationships with various outdoor professionals throughout her decades of running the general store, guides, outfitters, and wilderness experts who could provide the physical capabilities needed for challenging mountain recovery operations. Sarah had developed the research skills and academic connections necessary for proper authentication and documentation. "There's a young man named David Clearwater who guides for the Forest Service during summers," Eleanor explained. "Grew up here, knows every trail and rock formation in the valley, has technical training in wilderness recovery operations. He's also working on a graduate degree in anthropology, so he understands archaeological procedures." The suggestion felt like a gift from the universe, addressing Sarah's primary concerns about attempting complex recovery operations without proper expertise or support. But it also represented commitment to pursuing Margaret's discoveries seriously, rather than continuing to treat them as interesting speculation. "Would he be interested in something like this?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer from Eleanor's confident expression. "Honey, David Clearwater has been fascinated by Margaret's research for years. He's one of the few people in town who took her theories seriously and encouraged her work. He'd probably volunteer just for the privilege of being involved in a legitimate archaeological discovery." By mid-April, snow had melted enough to reveal the Guardian Pass trailhead, though the higher elevations remained impassable. Sarah had made contact with David Clearwater and arranged to meet him for a preliminary assessment of access conditions and recovery requirements. The meeting would represent her final decision point. She could continue treating Margaret's discoveries as fascinating family history, maintaining their comfortable mountain life without additional complications. Or she could commit to pursuing archaeological authentication with all the risks and possibilities that such commitment would entail. As she prepared for what might be the most important conversation of her life, Sarah realized that Margaret had faced identical choices decades earlier. The decision to pursue historical mysteries rather than accepting conventional limitations, to risk everything for the possibility of extraordinary discovery. The weather forecast showed a clear window, opening in early May, perfect conditions for initial exploration attempts. Spring was coming to the mountains, and with it, the opportunity to finally learn whether Margaret's lifetime of research had led to genuine archaeological treasures or elaborate fantasy. The answer waited somewhere above the tree line, hidden among granite guardians and ancient streams, exactly where her great-aunt had promised it would be. The meeting with David Clearwater took place on the first genuinely warm day of spring, when afternoon temperatures finally climbed into the 60s, and the Guardian Pass trailhead became accessible for the first time since October. Sarah had driven up the narrow mountain road with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that reminded her of job interviews and first dates, knowing that this conversation would determine whether Margaret's archaeological mystery remained family folklore or became a serious scientific pursuit. David was waiting at the trailhead when she arrived, and Sarah's first impression was of someone who belonged in the mountains as naturally as the pine trees and granite outcroppings, tall and lean with the kind of weathered competence that came from years of outdoor work. He moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to challenging terrain and unpredictable conditions. His backpack and equipment suggested serious wilderness capabilities, while his easy smile and careful questions demonstrated the academic training Eleanor had mentioned. "Margaret talked about you for years," he said after their initial introductions, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who'd grown up in mountain communities. She was convinced that her great-niece would eventually understand the significance of what she'd discovered up here. They spent the first hour hiking the lower portion of the Guardian Pass Trail, with David pointing out landmarks that featured prominently in Margaret's journals, while Sarah shared details from her great-aunt's research that weren't common knowledge. The geographical correlations were remarkable. Every major feature Margaret had described in her theoretical expedition routes was exactly where her journals claimed it would be. "She wasn't guessing about any of this," David observed, as they paused at a distinctive rock formation that Margaret had identified as a likely expedition landmark. This kind of geographical accuracy requires either extensive field research or access to very detailed historical sources. Sarah produced the artifacts Eleanor had given her, watching David's expression change from polite interest to genuine excitement as he examined the metal disc, leather fragment, and coded paper. His anthropological training was immediately apparent in the careful way he handled the items, using techniques that protected them from contamination while allowing detailed examination. "These are legitimate," he said, after several minutes of careful study. "The metal shows oxidation patterns consistent with early 19th century materials, and the leather has aging characteristics that would be nearly impossible to fake. Most importantly, the craftsmanship techniques match what we know about expedition equipment from that period." The authentication felt like a victory, but David's next observation introduced complications Sarah hadn't fully considered. "The problem is that items this significant require professional documentation from the moment of discovery. If Margaret recovered these from an undisturbed archaeological site, then that site has already been compromised by amateur excavation." The implications were sobering. Professional archaeologists spent years documenting site conditions before, removing any artifacts, creating detailed records of exactly where items were found and what other materials were present. Margaret's recovery efforts, however well-intentioned, might have destroyed crucial contextual information that could never be recovered. "Does that make the artifacts worthless scientifically?" Sarah asked, feeling her dreams of legitimate discovery beginning to crumble. "Not worthless, but significantly less valuable than they would have been with proper site documentation," David replied honestly. "However, if the site contains additional materials that haven't been disturbed, we might be able to establish enough context to authenticate Margaret's earlier findings." They continued up the trail, discussing the technical requirements for legitimate archaeological recovery, while David assessed terrain conditions and access challenges. The conversation revealed the enormous complexity of proper archaeological work, involving not just physical recovery, but detailed documentation, photographic records, soil analysis, and coordination with multiple academic institutions. "The good news is that your nursing background gives you many of the observational and documentation skills that archaeology requires," David explained as they climbed toward the tree line. "The attention to detail, the systematic approach to evidence, the ability to work carefully under pressure, those are exactly the qualities that make the difference between treasure hunting and legitimate research." By late afternoon, they had reached the area Margaret's journals identified as the most likely cache location. The site was extraordinary, a natural amphitheater surrounded by granite walls with 3 streams converging to create a sheltered camping area that offered both protection and strategic visibility. Anyone familiar with wilderness travel would recognize it immediately as an ideal location for extended stops. David spent nearly an hour surveying the area with professional thoroughness, identifying subtle signs that suggested previous human occupation, cleared areas that might have accommodated tents, fire rings that had been deliberately constructed and later scattered, even faint depressions that could indicate buried materials. Margaret was right about the location, he concluded. This site shows clear evidence of historical use, probably by multiple groups over an extended period. The question is whether any intact archaeological deposits remain after her excavations. Sarah felt a surge of excitement mixed with profound responsibility. They were standing where Lewis and Clark might have camped, where Sacagawea might have gathered water, where crucial decisions about American exploration might have been made around evening fires 2 centuries ago. But David's next observation brought her back to practical realities. If we're going to do this properly, we need institutional support before we disturb anything else. One person with a shovel is treasure hunting. A team with proper documentation is archaeology. The drive back to town was filled with planning, discussions that transformed vague possibilities into concrete next steps. David had connections with the Colorado State University Archaeology Department that could provide academic legitimacy for their research. Sarah had documentation of Margaret's findings that could justify institutional interest in the site. Together, they might be able to assemble the resources necessary for legitimate archaeological investigation. Dr. Morrison is going to want to see those artifacts in person before committing any university resources, David warned. And she'll probably want assurances that you're willing to follow proper archaeological protocols, even if they conflict with immediate financial interests. The warning was both necessary and troubling. Sarah's financial motivations weren't entirely mercenary, but they weren't entirely altruistic either. The potential value of Lewis and Clark artifacts could solve long-term security concerns for both herself and Marcus, but only if she retained some ownership rights over any discoveries. "What typically happens to artifacts found on private land?" she asked, dreading the answer. "Depends on their historical significance and how they're recovered," David replied diplomatically. "Items found through legitimate archaeological research usually remain with the landowner, but anything deemed nationally significant can trigger federal involvement. The key is establishing clear documentation of the discovery process and ownership rights before federal agencies become interested." That evening, Sarah sat in the cabin with Margaret's journals spread before her, feeling the weight of decisions that could affect multiple generations of her family. The artifacts in Eleanor's box represented proof that Margaret's discoveries were real, but they also represented legal and ethical obligations that extended far beyond personal financial gain. Marcus noticed her preoccupation during their bedtime. Routine, his 7-year-old intuition picking up on tensions she tried to hide. "Are we going to find the treasure, Mom? David seems like he knows what he's doing." "We're going to try to understand what Great-Aunt Margaret discovered," Sarah replied carefully. "But it's more complicated than just finding treasure. We have to make sure we do everything the right way so that historians and museums can learn from whatever we find. But we get to keep some of it, right? Since it's on our land." His innocent question crystallized her internal conflict. The practical part of her mind calculated college costs, retirement planning, and long-term financial security that authentic Lewis and Clark artifacts could provide. But the professional part recognized obligations to historical preservation and scientific research that transcended personal benefit. "Some of it, probably," she answered honestly, but the most important thing is making sure that whatever we find helps people understand history better. The next morning brought an email from Dr. Morrison that shifted the entire dynamic of their archaeological plans. The university's anthropology department had received a federal grant to investigate early expedition routes through the Colorado Rockies, with specific interest in sites that might contain Lewis and Clark materials. Your great-aunt's research appears to correlate with historical evidence we've been developing through other sources, Dr. Morrison wrote. If the artifacts you've described are authentic, they could provide crucial confirmation of theories about northern return routes that have been debated for decades. The grant funding would provide resources for proper archaeological investigation, including ground-penetrating radar, soil analysis, and expert documentation that could authenticate any discoveries. More importantly, university involvement would provide legal protection against federal seizure, while ensuring that Sarah retained appropriate ownership rights over materials found on her property. The timing is almost too perfect, Sarah told Eleanor during their next conversation. It's as if Margaret planned for everything to come together exactly when I was ready to handle it properly. Margaret was always thinking 10 steps ahead, Eleanor replied with a knowing smile. She probably spent years researching not just the archaeological possibilities, but the legal and academic requirements for legitimate discovery. She wanted to make sure that when the time came, you'd have everything you needed to do it right. David's connections proved invaluable in establishing the formal relationship between Sarah's private research and the university's archaeological program. By the end of April, they had assembled a team that included academic archaeologists, graduate students specializing in early American exploration, and technical specialists capable of conducting sophisticated site analysis. The legal framework was equally important. Sarah would retain ownership of any artifacts found on her property, but would loan significant discoveries to appropriate museums for display and research. The university would handle authentication, documentation, and publication of findings, while Sarah received recognition as co-discoverer and appropriate compensation for her contributions to the research. It's the best possible outcome, David assured her as they finalized the collaboration agreements. You maintain ownership rights while ensuring that discoveries receive proper scientific treatment. Margaret would be proud of how you've handled this. The first formal archaeological survey was scheduled for early May, when weather conditions would allow extended work at high altitude. Ground-penetrating radar would map subsurface anomalies that might indicate buried materials, while careful surface analysis would document existing evidence of historical occupation. Sarah found herself simultaneously excited and terrified by the approaching investigation. Months of research and planning had built Margaret's discoveries into something approaching legend in her mind, but reality might prove disappointingly mundane. Archaeological sites that seemed promising often yielded nothing more than scattered debris and ambiguous evidence, yet the preliminary signs were encouraging. Margaret's artifacts were clearly authentic, her geographical analysis was remarkably accurate, and her research methodology showed sophisticated understanding of archaeological principles. Most importantly, she had spent 40 years investigating the site before claiming to have made significant discoveries. The night before the university team's arrival, Sarah walked the short distance from the cabin to the ridge overlooking Guardian Pass. The site was invisible in darkness, but she could feel its presence in the landscape. A place where history might have paused long enough to leave traces that had survived 2 centuries of mountain weather. Marcus joined her on the ridge, his small hand finding hers in the darkness. "Are you nervous, Mum?" "A little," she admitted. "Tomorrow might change everything for us, or it might prove that Great-Aunt Margaret was chasing impossible dreams. But we tried," Marcus observed with 7-year-old wisdom. "That's what Daddy would have said, right? That trying is what matters." Sarah felt tears threatening as she thought of Marcus's father, who had died before his son was old enough to remember him clearly. But Marcus was right. The man she'd loved had always believed in pursuing possibilities rather than accepting limitations, in taking calculated risks rather than settling for safe mediocrity. "Yes," she whispered, squeezing her son's hand. "Daddy would have said that. Some dreams are worth chasing, even if we're not sure where they'll lead." The archaeological team would arrive at dawn, bringing equipment and expertise that could finally answer questions that had consumed Margaret's lifetime and had now captured Sarah's imagination. Win or lose, they would know the truth about the Guardian Pass site and the secrets it might contain. Standing in mountain darkness with her son beside her, Sarah felt the same mixture of fear and anticipation that must have driven every explorer. Who had ever stood at the edge of unknown territory, wondering what lay beyond the next ridge, what treasures or disasters waited in unexplored places? Tomorrow would bring answers, but tonight brought the precious uncertainty that made discovery possible. The archaeological team arrived at dawn in a convoy of university vehicles loaded with equipment that looked more suited to a space mission than a mountain expedition. Dr. Rachel Morrison stepped out of the lead truck with the efficient confidence of someone accustomed to managing complex field operations, her weathered face and practical gear suggesting decades of outdoor archaeological work in challenging conditions. Sarah felt a flutter of intimidation as she watched the team unload ground-penetrating radar units, soil analysis equipment, precision mapping instruments, and documentation cameras that probably cost more than her annual salary. This was legitimate science, conducted by professionals who'd spent years developing the expertise needed to extract maximum information from archaeological sites while preserving their integrity for future research. Mrs. Chen, Dr. Morrison, approached with a firm handshake and evaluating gaze. "I've been fascinated by your great-aunt's research ever since David shared her journals with me. The geographical correlations with known expedition routes are remarkable for someone working without institutional support." The compliment felt genuine, but Sarah detected undertones of professional skepticism that she'd expected from academic researchers approached by amateur treasure hunters. Building credibility would require demonstrating respect for proper procedures and understanding of archaeological principles that went beyond casual interest in historical discovery. Marcus watched the equipment set up with 7-year-old fascination, asking questions about radar technology and soil sampling that impressed the graduate students with their sophistication. His curiosity reminded Sarah that this investigation would affect his future as much as hers, potentially providing educational opportunities and financial security that could shape his entire life trajectory. David served as liaison between Sarah's amateur enthusiasm and the university team's professional requirements, his dual background in wilderness guiding and anthropological training making him invaluable for navigating both technical and interpersonal challenges. His presence provided Sarah with confidence that Margaret's discoveries would receive appropriate respect, regardless of their ultimate significance. The hike to Guardian Pass took 3 hours with the equipment convoy, significantly longer than Sarah's previous reconnaissance trips, but necessary to transport the sophisticated instruments required for comprehensive site analysis. The team moved with military precision, each member responsible for specific equipment and documentation tasks that would create the permanent record required for legitimate archaeological research. Dr. Morrison's reaction to the site itself was everything Sarah had hoped for. The professional archaeologist spent nearly an hour surveying the natural amphitheater, identifying features that confirmed Margaret's geographical analysis while documenting evidence of historical human occupation that less trained observers might have missed. This is exactly the kind of location that experienced wilderness travelers would choose for extended encampments, she observed, while photographing distinctive rock formations that could have served as landmarks for expedition. Navigation, natural shelter, strategic visibility, reliable water sources, and defensible positioning. Your great-aunt's site selection was extraordinarily sophisticated. The ground-penetrating radar survey began immediately, with technicians methodically mapping subsurface anomalies across the entire amphitheater area. The equipment could detect buried objects, disturbed soil patterns, and density variations that might indicate archaeological deposits, creating a three-dimensional map of everything hidden beneath the surface. Sarah watched the radar images appear on computer screens with growing excitement as anomalies appeared in locations that corresponded exactly to Margaret's theoretical cache sites. Linear patterns suggested deliberately buried objects, while density variations indicated soil disturbance that could represent historical excavation or natural deposition of materials. These readings are consistent with buried metallic objects, the radar technician reported after completing the initial survey. Multiple contacts at varying depths, with patterns suggesting intentional placement rather than random distribution. Dr. Morrison's professional composure couldn't entirely hide her excitement as she studied the radar data. We're looking at what appears to be a significant archaeological site with multiple buried features. The question is whether these represent historical deposits or more recent activities. The distinction was crucial for both legal and scientific purposes. Recent burials would indicate treasure hunters or amateur archaeologists who had disturbed the site, potentially destroying valuable contextual information. Historical deposits would represent intact archaeological materials that could provide unprecedented insights into early American exploration. Soil sampling began immediately, with team members collecting samples from locations showing the strongest radar signatures. Laboratory analysis would determine the age of soil disturbance, identify any organic materials that could be carbon dated, and detect chemical signatures that might indicate buried metals or other materials. Sarah found herself both fascinated and frustrated by the methodical pace of professional archaeology. Every step required documentation, every sample needed labeling and chain of custody procedures. Every photograph demanded precise positioning and technical specifications. The process that had consumed Margaret's lifetime was being compressed into days, but those days stretched like weeks as anticipation built with each confirmed anomaly. Archaeological investigation is 90% preparation and documentation, 10% actual discovery, David explained during a break in the radar survey. But that preparation is what makes the difference between legitimate research and treasure hunting. Marcus had appointed himself unofficial team mascot, helping with equipment transport and asking questions that revealed remarkable understanding of archaeological principles for someone his age. The graduate students were charmed by his enthusiasm and impressed by his retention of technical information, suggesting academic aptitude that could benefit from the educational opportunities that significant discoveries might provide. By the end of the first day, the team had mapped 17 distinct anomalies, suggesting buried objects with patterns indicating both historical and more recent disturbance. The radar data supported Margaret's theories about multiple expeditions using the site over extended periods, while soil analysis provided preliminary evidence of metallic objects buried at depths consistent with early 19th century timeframes. Tomorrow, we begin actual excavation, Dr. Morrison announced during the evening briefing conducted around a campfire that reminded Sarah of the historical expeditions that might have used this same site 2 centuries earlier. We'll start with the anomalies showing the strongest signatures and work systematically through the site. The anticipation was almost unbearable. Sarah lay in her sleeping bag staring at stars that Lewis and Clark might have seen from the same location, wondering whether tomorrow would vindicate Margaret's lifetime of research or reveal that sophisticated equipment could detect buried objects that proved to be nothing more than abandoned camping gear. The first excavation began at dawn, with Dr. Morrison selecting a radar anomaly that suggested a large metallic object buried approximately 2 feet below the surface. The dig proceeded with scientific precision, each layer of soil carefully removed and sifted, every artifact photographed in place before removal, all activities documented with detailed notes and precise measurements. Sarah's heart raced as the excavation revealed a linear depression in the soil, clearly artificial and suggesting a deliberately buried container. The soil coloration indicated disturbance that could date to the early 1800s, while small fragments of oxidized metal confirmed the presence of buried metallic objects. "We have contact," the excavation leader announced after exposing what appeared to be the corner of a metal container. Rectangular object, approximately 12 inches by 8 inches, showing oxidation patterns consistent with early 19th century materials. The container required another hour of careful excavation before it could be safely removed, during which time the team documented every detail of its burial position, surrounding soil conditions, and relationship to other site features. Sarah watched with growing excitement as the object emerged, clearly artificial and showing craftsmanship consistent with expedition equipment from the Lewis and Clark period. Dr. Morrison's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the container from its burial place, recognizing immediately that they had discovered something of extraordinary historical significance. The metal showed oxidation patterns that would be nearly impossible to fake, while construction techniques matched documented examples of early 19th century military equipment. This appears to be a genuine military cache container from the early 1800s, she announced after careful examination of the exterior markings. The craftsmanship and materials are consistent with documented Lewis and Clark expedition equipment. Opening the container required moving to a controlled environment where the contents could be protected from contamination and weather exposure. The team transported the cache to a field laboratory they had established in a large tent equipped with proper lighting, documentation equipment, and conservation materials. Sarah felt herself holding her breath as Dr. Morrison carefully opened the container, revealing contents that exceeded even Margaret's most optimistic predictions. Wrapped in oiled leather that had provided remarkable preservation, the cache contained items that were unmistakably authentic expedition materials. The first item was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but perfectly legible, containing entries in handwriting that matched authenticated Lewis and Clark documents. The entries described the northern route through Colorado mountains, detailed geographical observations, and most importantly, references to additional caches buried at higher elevations. "This is Meriwether Lewis's personal journal from the return journey," Dr. Morrison whispered with professional awe. "These entries have never been published, never been seen by historians. This could revolutionize our understanding of the expedition's return route." But the journal was only the beginning. The cache also contained detailed maps drawn in Lewis's distinctive style, showing gold deposits they had discovered but couldn't exploit, Native American settlements they had encountered, and geographical features that weren't documented in any known expedition records. Most extraordinary was a collection of letters written by Sacagawea herself, dictated to Lewis and preserved in her own phonetic spelling of English words. The letters described her experiences during the expedition from her unique perspective, providing insights into expedition dynamics that were completely absent from official accounts written by the expedition leaders. These letters alone are priceless from a historical perspective, Dr. Morrison observed, while carefully photographing each document. Sacagawea's voice has been almost entirely absent from Lewis and Clark's scholarship. These provide the first direct account of the expedition from her viewpoint. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of the discovery. Margaret's decades of research had led to findings that would literally rewrite American history, providing new insights into one of the nation's most important expeditions while revealing previously unknown details about its most famous participants. But Dr. Morrison's next observation introduced complications that Sarah hadn't fully anticipated. Discoveries of this significance require immediate notification of federal authorities. The National Park Service, the Smithsonian, and probably the FBI will need to be contacted before we proceed further. The prospect of federal involvement was both exciting and terrifying. Government attention would provide authentication and protection for the discoveries, but it could also result in lengthy legal proceedings, potential seizure of materials, and loss of control over artifacts found on Sarah's own property. What happens to the artifacts if federal agencies become involved? Sarah asked, dreading the answer, but needing to understand the legal implications of their discovery. That depends on how cooperation proceeds, Dr. Morrison replied diplomatically. Landowners who work with authorities typically retain ownership rights while artifacts are studied and displayed. Those who attempt to conceal significant discoveries often face federal prosecution and forfeiture of materials. The choice was clear but difficult. Cooperation offered the best chance of retaining some ownership while ensuring proper preservation and study of the materials. Concealment risked criminal prosecution and complete loss of the discoveries, but also preserved maximum control over artifacts that could secure her family's financial future. David sensed her internal conflict and provided the guidance that helped clarify her decision. Margaret spent 40 years researching these materials because she believed they were important to American history. She trusted you to make sure they received proper treatment, not to hide them for personal gain. His words reminded Sarah that her inheritance involved responsibilities as well as opportunities. Margaret had preserved these secrets for decades, waiting for someone who would pursue authentication through legitimate channels rather than seeking quick profit through black market sales. That evening, as the team secured the site and prepared for expanded excavation of additional anomalies, Sarah made the decision that would determine her family's future. She authorized Dr. Morrison to contact federal authorities, beginning the process that would transform their discovery from private treasure into public heritage. The choice felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying, representing commitment to a path that could lead to recognition and reward, or to legal complications and financial loss. But it was the choice Margaret would have made, the choice that honored the historical significance of their discoveries while accepting the uncertainties that came with doing the right thing. Marcus sensed the gravity of the moment as they prepared for sleep in their mountain camp. "Are we doing the right thing, Mom?" "I think so, baby," Sarah replied, pulling him close in the darkness. "Sometimes the right thing is the hardest thing, but that's what makes it right." Tomorrow would bring federal agents, additional archaeologists, and media attention that would transform their quiet mountain life into something far more complicated. But tonight brought the satisfaction of discoveries that justified Margaret's lifetime of research, and the hope that doing right by history would ultimately provide the security and opportunities Sarah sought for her son's future. The cache was only the beginning. The radar had detected 16 additional anomalies, each potentially containing discoveries that could rival the significance of Lewis's journal and Sacagawea's letters. Margaret's great secret was becoming America's great revelation, one artifact at a time. The federal response arrived with a swiftness that took Sarah's breath away. Within 18 hours of Dr. Morrison's notification, Guardian Pass swarmed with activity that transformed their quiet archaeological dig into what resembled a military operation. FBI agents, National Park Service investigators, Smithsonian representatives, and additional university researchers descended on the site with an efficiency that spoke to the extraordinary significance of their discoveries. Agent Patricia Valdez from the FBI's Art Crime team took operational control with the kind of professional competence that both reassured and intimidated Sarah. A woman in her 40s with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, she moved through the site with the systematic thoroughness of someone accustomed to protecting irreplaceable cultural artifacts from theft, fraud, and improper handling. Mrs. Chen, Agent Valdez approached Sarah with a firm handshake and direct gaze. I understand you've been extraordinarily cooperative in reporting these discoveries. That cooperation will work in your favor as we navigate the legal complexities involved in finds of this magnitude. The reassurance felt genuine, but Sarah detected undertones of warning that reminded her how quickly cooperation could become investigation if federal authorities suspected any impropriety in the discovery or handling of the artifacts. The line between legitimate archaeological research and federal treasure hunting violations was thinner than she'd realized. Marcus watched the federal agents with wide-eyed fascination, his 7-year-old mind processing the sudden transformation of their mountain adventure into something that looked like scenes from television crime dramas. Sarah pulled him close, worried that the adult tensions and legal complexities might frighten him, but he seemed more excited than anxious about the attention their discovery was receiving. "Mom, are we famous now?" he whispered during a break. In the formal interviews that Agent Valdez was conducting with everyone who had been involved in the excavation. "I think we might be, baby," Sarah replied, uncertain whether fame was something to celebrate or fear given their circumstances. Dr. Morrison had been transformed by federal involvement from lead archaeologist to advisory consultant. Her university team, now working under federal oversight, that imposed additional documentation requirements and security protocols. The change was both frustrating and necessary, ensuring that discoveries of national significance received appropriate protection while slowing the pace of excavation to bureaucratic speeds. The Smithsonian's representative, Dr. Elizabeth Harrington, brought 40 years of Lewis and Clark scholarship to the authentication process. Her examination of the journal and letters found in the first cache confirmed what everyone already suspected, but needed official verification to establish. "These documents are unquestionably authentic," she announced, after conducting preliminary analysis using portable spectrographic equipment that could identify ink compositions, paper aging, and other markers of historical authenticity. The eye's handwriting matches authenticated Lewis samples. The paper shows aging consistent with early 19th century materials, and the ink composition corresponds to formulations known from the period. The authentication felt like vindication for Margaret's decades of research, but it also triggered legal procedures that Sarah hadn't fully anticipated. Federal law required detailed investigation of how the artifacts had been discovered, who had handled them, and whether proper protocols had been followed throughout the recovery process. Agent Valdez spent hours interviewing Sarah about Margaret's research, Eleanor's role in preserving artifacts, and David's involvement in organizing the university excavation. The questions were methodical and sometimes repetitive, designed to identify any inconsistencies that might suggest improper handling or undisclosed discoveries. "Your great-aunt's journals indicate she found these materials in 1983, Agent Valdez observed during one particularly intense interview session, yet she never reported the discovery to appropriate authorities. Can you explain why she chose to conceal archaeological findings of such obvious significance?" Sarah had anticipated this question and prepared an answer that honored Margaret's motivations while acknowledging the complexity of her situation. Margaret tried to interest academic institutions in her research for years, but was dismissed as an amateur treasure hunter. She was afraid that reporting discoveries without institutional support would result in their seizure by authorities who wouldn't properly authenticate or preserve them. The explanation was both true and diplomatically phrased, avoiding criticism of academic prejudices while acknowledging the legitimate concerns that had driven Margaret's secrecy. Agent Valdez seemed satisfied with the response, but continued probing for details about the timeline of discoveries and the condition of materials when Sarah first encountered them. The second excavation proceeded under federal supervision, with additional security measures that included armed guards and restricted access to the site. Sarah found the militarization both impressive and slightly disturbing, a reminder that their discovery had implications extending far beyond personal, financial gain or academic recognition. The second cache exceeded even the extraordinary findings of the first container. Buried at a greater depth and showing signs of more deliberate concealment, it contained materials that suggested Lewis and Clark had made multiple stops in the Guardian Pass area over several weeks, rather than passing through quickly, as historians had always assumed. This cache contains survey equipment, detailed geological samples, and what appears to be assay results from mineral deposits they discovered in the area, Dr. Harrington reported after careful examination of the container's contents. They weren't just passing through. They were conducting systematic exploration of the region's natural resources. The implications were staggering for American historical scholarship. The accepted narrative of the Lewis and Clark expedition had them returning via southern routes through established passages, not conducting extended geological surveys in remote Colorado mountains. These discoveries suggested that significant portions of the expedition's activities had never been documented in official accounts. But the most extraordinary find was a sealed pouch containing what appeared to be gold samples and rough maps showing deposit locations throughout the Colorado Rockies. Lewis and Clark had discovered gold deposits that wouldn't be officially found until the Pikes Peak gold rush 60 years later, potentially rewriting the entire history of Western mining development. These assay results show gold concentrations that would have represented enormous wealth even by expedition standards, Dr. Harrington observed while photographing the mineral samples. The question is why Lewis and Clark never reported these discoveries to President Jefferson. Sarah listened to the scholarly discussions with growing appreciation for the complexity of historical research and the significance of Margaret's discoveries. Her great-aunt hadn't just found treasure. She had uncovered evidence that could fundamentally alter understanding of American exploration, Western development, and the true scope of the Lewis and Clark expedition's accomplishments. The media. Attention began within days of the federal investigation, starting with local newspaper reports, but quickly escalating to national coverage as the significance of the discoveries became apparent. Sarah found herself thrust into a spotlight she hadn't anticipated, fielding interview requests from news organizations, documentary producers, and historical societies eager to learn more about the Guardian Pass findings. Single mother discovers. Lewis and Clark treasure cache became the headline that followed Sarah wherever she went, reducing Margaret's sophisticated research and their careful archaeological work to a simplified narrative that emphasized dramatic discovery over scholarly methodology. The attention was simultaneously flattering and overwhelming, providing recognition while creating pressures she struggled to manage. Marcus adapted to media attention with the resilience that seemed characteristic of his personality, treating interview requests and photographer visits as exciting adventures rather than intrusions on their privacy. His natural curiosity and articulate responses made him a favorite with journalists who found his 7-year-old perspective on historical discovery both charming and surprisingly insightful. "We found treasure, but it's not the kind you keep in a box," he explained to one television reporter. "It's the kind that helps everyone learn about history." His words captured the essence of their situation better than any adult explanation could have managed, emphasizing the educational value of their discoveries while acknowledging their material significance. The legal negotiations surrounding ownership and display rights proved more complex than anyone had anticipated. Federal law provided some protection for landowners who cooperated with authorities, but the national significance of Lewis and Clark materials created competing claims from multiple institutions and government agencies. The Smithsonian wanted the artifacts for their permanent Lewis and Clark collection. The Colorado Historical Society claimed jurisdiction based on the discovery location. The National Park Service argued that materials of such significance should be preserved in federal repositories. Each institution offered different compensation packages and exhibition arrangements that could affect both Sarah's financial returns and public recognition of her role in the discoveries. Agent Valdez guided Sarah through the negotiations with professional competence that protected her interests while ensuring compliance with federal regulations. "The key is establishing clear documentation of your cooperation and the legitimacy of your discovery process," she explained during one particularly complex negotiation session. "Institutions compete for significant artifacts, but landowners who work properly with authorities typically receive favorable terms." The financial implications remained uncertain, but promising. Authenticated Lewis and Clark materials commanded extraordinary prices when they occasionally appeared at auction, sometimes reaching millions of dollars for items of exceptional historical significance. Even with institutional claims and federal oversight, Sarah's ownership rights could translate into life-changing compensation. But more immediately important were the ongoing excavations that continued to yield discoveries rivaling the significance of the initial caches. The third excavation revealed personal items belonging to expedition members, Sacagawea's beadwork, Clark's surveying instruments, and most remarkably, a collection of pressed botanical specimens that Lewis had been gathering for scientific study. These botanical samples represent species that weren't officially catalogued until decades later, Dr. Harrington reported with barely contained excitement. Lewis was conducting advanced scientific research that has never been recognized by historians, because the specimens were never delivered to President Jefferson. Each discovery added layers to the emerging picture of an expedition that had been far more comprehensive and scientifically sophisticated than official accounts suggested. Lewis and Clark hadn't just been exploring territory, they had been conducting systematic research into geology, botany, anthropology, and natural resource development that could have accelerated American understanding of Western territories by decades. The fourth cache contained what everyone agreed was the most significant discovery yet, a complete set of expedition maps drawn to scales and with details that surpassed anything in official expedition records. The maps showed not just geographical features, but resource locations, tribal territories, and potential settlement sites that could have guided American Western development along entirely different lines. These maps represent knowledge that could have changed American history, Dr. Harrington observed while studying the cartographic details. If Jefferson had received this information, Western expansion might have proceeded along completely different routes with completely different priorities. Sarah found herself wondering about historical what-ifs, while simultaneously managing the practical realities of discoveries that were transforming her family's circumstances in real time. The media attention had brought speaking requests, book deals, and consulting opportunities that could provide financial security beyond anything the artifacts themselves might generate. Eleanor watched the unfolding developments with the satisfaction of someone who had known Margaret's secret for decades and had finally seen it receive appropriate recognition. Margaret would be so proud, she told Sarah during one of their regular conversations. She always said that knowledge wanted to be shared, that discoveries only mattered if they helped other people understand the world better. But Eleanor also provided practical guidance about managing sudden fame and financial opportunities that could be overwhelming for someone unaccustomed to public attention. "Don't let the excitement make you forget what's really important," she warned. "You've got a son to raise and a life to live beyond whatever treasures come out of those mountains." The advice proved prescient, as Sarah struggled to balance archaeological commitments with parenting responsibilities and nursing duties that couldn't be indefinitely postponed. Pine Ridge still needed medical care. Marcus still needed consistent parenting, and their mountain life still required attention to practical details that fame and treasure hunting couldn't address. David continued serving as liaison between the various competing interests, his anthropological training and wilderness expertise making him invaluable for coordinating between federal agents, university researchers, media representatives, and the Chen family's personal needs. His calm competence provided stability during a period when Sarah often felt overwhelmed by the pace of developments. "Remember that this is a marathon, not a sprint," he advised during one particularly hectic day when 3 television crews, 2 federal agents, and a documentary producer were all demanding Sarah's attention simultaneously. The artifacts waited, 2 centuries to be discovered. The rest of the process can proceed at whatever pace works for you and Marcus. As autumn began to color the aspen groves around Guardian Pass, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with Margaret's mysterious inheritance and had led to discoveries that were literally rewriting American history. The treasure had been real, the authentication successful, and the recognition gratifying beyond anything she could have imagined. But the most important discovery had been something Margaret couldn't have cached in any container. The realization that ordinary people could make extraordinary contributions to human knowledge when they combined careful research with persistent dedication and the courage to pursue possibilities that others dismissed as impossible. The excavations would continue through winter in heated shelters, with additional caches waiting to reveal whatever other secrets Lewis and Clark had hidden in the Colorado mountains. Each discovery brought new complications and new opportunities, but also brought deeper understanding of the complex motivations that had driven America's most famous expedition into territories that official history had forgotten. Sarah Chen had inherited more than a cabin and some family mysteries. She had inherited the responsibility for preserving and sharing knowledge that could change how Americans understood their own history, their relationship with Western landscapes, and the sophisticated scientific work that had been conducted by explorers whose accomplishments had been systematically underestimated by generations of historians. The treasure hunt was ending, but the real work of historical preservation and education was just beginning. 2 years after the initial discovery at Guardian Pass, Sarah Chen stood before a packed auditorium at the Smithsonian Institution, delivering the keynote address for the opening of The Hidden Journey, Lewis and Clark's Lost Discoveries. The exhibition featured artifacts from 17 different caches that had been systematically excavated from sites throughout the Colorado Rockies, each one revealing new dimensions of America's most famous expedition. Marcus, now 9 years, old and confidently articulate in ways that amazed everyone who met him, sat in the front row wearing his best suit and a proud smile that reminded Sarah of his father. The boy, who had once worried about having a home, now traveled regularly to speak at schools and museums about the importance of historical preservation and the adventures that awaited curious minds willing to ask difficult questions. "When my great-aunt Margaret left me that cabin," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone to an audience that included senators, historians, and documentary filmmakers, "she wasn't just giving me shelter. She was entrusting me with secrets that had waited 2 centuries for someone brave enough to pursue them properly." The audience responded with the kind of attentive silence that indicated genuine engagement rather than polite obligation. These were people who understood the significance of archaeological discovery and appreciated the complex journey that had brought Margaret's research from mountain isolation to national recognition. The exhibition behind Sarah displayed artifacts that had revolutionized understanding of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Sacagawea's beadwork and personal letters had provided the first direct account of the journey from her perspective, revealing leadership qualities and scientific contributions that official expedition records had systematically minimized. Clark's advanced surveying equipment had demonstrated technological sophistication that historians had never credited to the expedition. Most importantly, Lewis's detailed geological surveys and mineral assays had shown that American knowledge of Western resources had been far more advanced than anyone had realized. "The 17 caches we've authenticated represent more than treasure," Sarah continued, gesturing toward display cases containing gold samples, botanical specimens, and cartographic materials that were rewriting textbooks across multiple academic disciplines. "They represent the difference between what happened and what was officially recorded, between the expedition's actual accomplishments and the simplified narrative that entered American mythology." The financial implications had exceeded even Sarah's most optimistic projections. Authentication and institutional sales of duplicate materials had generated enough income to establish college funds for Marcus, purchase the entire Guardian Pass Valley for permanent preservation, and create the Margaret Chen Foundation for Archaeological Research, which provided grants for amateur researchers whose work showed promise but lacked institutional support. But the personal transformation had been even more significant than the financial windfall. Sarah had transitioned from nursing to historical consulting, working with universities and museums to develop protocols for amateur archaeological discoveries that protected both scientific integrity and landowner rights. Her expertise in managing complex discoveries while maintaining family stability had made her a sought-after speaker and consultant for similar situations worldwide. David Clearwater had completed his graduate degree in anthropology and now served as director of field operations for the Margaret Chen Foundation, coordinating between amateur researchers and academic institutions to ensure that potentially significant discoveries received appropriate professional attention. His combination of wilderness skills and scholarly training had proven invaluable for bridging the gap between treasure hunting and legitimate archaeology.